decent dad and a mediocre slow pitch softball player is how I describe myself on the bio that I put on my website. And it's sort of to be funny, but also because I think that being a dad is probably the most important thing that I can do. Like, I think that I have two kids, and they're older now. My daughter is a freshman in college, and my son is a junior in high school. And since they were born, and it's a cliche, right? But my life centers around like thinking about them. And my last book of poetry is very much influenced it's about being a parent and being a father and what that means to me and thinking about where my ideas of parenthood came from. And mediocre slow pitch softball players, because I grew up playing baseball and I still play slow pitch softball, and I play in a team full of professors, and we are terrible, but we have a good time. So that is that's why I put that on my bio, because I wanted to, I don't know, those are the things that interest me. I get a lot of pleasure out of continuing to be active. And, my son is a soccer player. My daughter played fast pitch softball growing up. I coached her teams. And so sports is something that has always been around my life. And so I thought it'd be a humorous thing to put in my bio, but also true. So when I was an undergraduate, I went to Birmingham Southern College in Birmingham, Alabama. And I majored in English and went to grad school right out of undergrad in creative writing, thinking I was going to write the next great American novel, and got to grad school and very quickly realized that I didn't really know why I was there. I was probably dealing with some depression and anxiety, but also I didn't feel like I don't know, it didn't feel right. And so I ended up dropping out of grad school, and I got a job answering phones at the Tallahassee Democrat in Tallahassee, Florida. And that led to becoming a copy editor on the sports desk at the Democrat. And then we moved from, when my wife was doing her grad school, we moved to Kentucky, and I worked at the Courier-Journal in Louisville and the Lexington Herald-Leader as a copy editor at the News Enterprise in Hardin County, Kentucky, where I covered county government and healthcare as a reporter. And then when we came to Grand Rapids, I worked at the Grand Rapids Press on the sports desk. I was a copy editor and then assistant sports editor. And at some point after we got to Grand Rapids, I really missed being part of a community of writers, creative writing, because journalism was important and great, and I loved that career. So many positive memories and experiences doing that. But I realized I was really missing people who could talk about poetry, who could talk about writing. And so I started taking classes towards my MFA at Western Michigan while working full-time at the press. I commuted back and forth to Kalamazoo for 6.5 years and got my MFA. And then I was just in the right place at the right time. My wife works at Grand Valley, so I knew the writing teacher, the writing professor, the writing department there. And 1 year right after I finished my MFA, there was a larger than expected freshman enrollment, first year enrollment at Grand Valley. And the chair of the writing department called me and said, "How would you like to leave your job and come teach writing for me?" And I'm like, the newspaper business was falling off a cliff at that time, and morale was really bad. And I was thinking it felt like time for a change. And so I said, sure. And became a visiting professor, which I did for 3 years, and then got a full-time tenure-track job 3 years after that, where I got to teach creative writing, poetry, nonfiction, and it's like my favorite thing. I'm so lucky to have had that opportunity, and it was just luck. It's just right place, right time, know somebody, and but I'm really happy that I had that opportunity, and I love teaching. I love being a professor, and being in a room with students who are interested in poetry is such a privilege. I always tell them, like, right now there are more people in this room talking about poetry than anywhere else in the state of Michigan when we're having class, because it's, the world doesn't care about poetry in general, or they think they don't care about poetry. But then to have that audience, we're like, okay, we care about poetry, and we're here to talk about it for an hour and 15 minutes tonight, or 3 hours if it's a night class. And so it was a life change. It's very different than journalism, but I do feel like my experiences as an editor and a journalist help me teach, and I think they help me think about poetry, because being a journalist is all about telling stories and reaching an audience and telling important stories for a community, right? And I think that has a lot in common with poetry and with teaching. And so I feel like even though I was doing something different for a long time, I don't feel like who I am had to change. And I don't feel like I have to think differently about the world now that I'm a teacher and poet. I just am able to connect to people in a different way, to have different conversations about the world. But they're still about recording the history of a community and using language to reach people, to connect people, and to tell the stories of a community. And so I think that's what I was doing when I was at the press. We were telling the stories of this community, and poets do the same thing, just differently. One of the things that when I tell people outside of academia, outside of poetry, what I do for a living, one of the things they always ask is, can poetry be taught? And I'm like, well, trying, I think you can, or I wouldn't be doing what I do. And that they also ask if I ever, if I have students that I know are going to make it, whatever make it means. And students, and they're asking about talent. And I always say, sure, but that it's also not really up to me. It's up to the student. Because talent is only part of the process of making it. It's about deciding, the student has to decide and make the decision over and over again that they want poetry to be in their life. And it's such a rewarding experience to have those students that you see. And like, I have a sense that poetry is always going to be part of your life, whether you become a prize-winning published poet or not. That's not really, that's something that you can't really fully control. It's not up to me. It's up to you if that's what you want. But poetry and writing and storytelling is going to be part of your life. And it is an incredibly rewarding experience. And I feel like I really have very little to do with it. I mean, I'm just there. Anyone could do it, or anyone who cares about poetry, anyone who cares about writing. And my job is not to like gatekeep or decide who makes it or anoint the future of poetry or anything like that. My job is to put good poems in front of them and encourage them and say, if you want to do this, you can do this. And so reading poems and writing poems, and you don't need to take a class to be a poet. You don't need to take my class to be a poet, but you do need to read poems and write poems. And I can help you with that. And I can put some poems in front of you that you might not have discovered without me. You could have, because poems are out there in the world. You can always find poems. But that was what I got out of my own MFA, was my professors put poems in front of me that I wouldn't have found on my own. And then they were an audience for me, because what poets need is an audience. They need a reader. And I always tell my students that what we really want out of our readers is like, we want to crawl inside their soul and feel the exact moment when their heart breaks when they're reading our poem. And you don't really get that in the world. But in a class, you can come pretty close. And I can do a pretty good job of providing that. If I sit down with a student in my office and I'll go through a poem with them and tell them exactly how I'm feeling at every point in the poem, they get that feeling of, oh, this is what it's like to be read. And you can see some students, that's really like a transformative moment. It's important to them. And it's something that is always going to be something they're reaching for, something they're striving for, something that's going to be part of their life one way or another, off and on, for their whole life. The Dire Ives and other programs like that are such a great way to connect poets and connect people who think poetry is important. It's a cliche to say so, but writing can be kind of lonely, and you can feel like you're the only person who cares about these things. When you're sitting at your laptop or your notebook writing a poem, it's just you and the language. And what Dire Ives does is reminds us that there's lots of people in this community who care about poetry of all ages and all, credential levels. You don't have to be credentialed to be part of Dire Ives. You don't have to be in the in club. You don't have to, work at a university. You just have to care about poetry, and you can send your poems in. And whether you win or not is not what really matters. It's great to be acknowledged for your poetry, but what really matters is I wrote something and some people read it. I had a student who won one year, the year that Mark Doty judged. And she was a poem that she'd written in my class about her mother who had passed. And she was blown away that she had won, but she also kept talking to me about how amazing it was that Mark Doty had read her poem. She just wanted to have had her poem read, and to have it read by a poet that she had seen read at poetry night, that she admired. That's what mattered to her, even more than winning. And everyone got that. Everyone who was a finalist got that. Everyone who was read by the preliminary judges. I was a preliminary judge one year, and it's such an honor to have people trust you with their work, because that's what we do when we enter a contest or when we send a poem out to publication or just when we hand it to a friend. We're trusting them. We're trusting them to read it with an open heart and an open mind and to really engage with the words. And Dire Ives creates this space where we do that for each other, where the community says everyone who cares about poetry can come together and we can trust each other with this work. So I'm so happy to be part of a community where these kind of programs exist, where we can have space to share what's important to us, to share art, to share language. The Long Road Distillery Slam, that was my student, Kelsey May. She had been a student at Grand Valley, a writing major, and had taken a couple of classes with me. And she was one of those students for whom I knew that poetry was always going to be part of her life. And she was helping she was involved with the organization of the slam at Long Road Distillery. And she was looking for people to judge, and she had just graduated, I think, that summer. And so she contacted me and said, would you like to come be a judge at this poetry slam? And I didn't really know what I was doing because I knew what performance poetry was, but I hadn't judged before. And it was such a blast. I did it twice that summer, and it was, I tell people this all the time, that the first time I did that is like in an upstairs room at Long Road Distillers on the west side of Grand Rapids, and that room was the most diverse room I've ever been in Grand Rapids. You're in a lot of rooms in Grand Rapids that are not all that diverse. And this one was people of all ages, people of all genders, people of all sexual orientations, people of all races, and everyone's there for one purpose, which is to read or to perform and to listen to poetry. And poetry is not the only thing that could bring people together that way, but it is one thing. And it was sort of a magical experience. The energy in the room was fantastic. Everyone's excited, and it's so supportive. I mean, one of the things you think about poetry slams, performance poetry competitions, is that it's competitive. And of course it is competitive, but mostly it's supportive. Mostly it's, let's share this stuff that is important to us. And here's this thing that I wrote that is about the most traumatic moment in my life, and I'm going to share it with you, and you're going to cheer and snap, and it's going to be great. Or here's this thing that I wrote that's funny, that not really about my life, and I'm going to share it with you, and I'm going to feel that laughter. And so that was a great experience. I value that experience tremendously. And I met some people in that room that night and saw some people read. I saw a future student read that night. I didn't know her. And then she was one of my favorite students I've ever had, because she came in, it's like, I love poetry and I'm ready for this class. And do you remember judging me that night at the slam? I'm like, oh yeah. And then I met, Fable the Poet and Kid Kane, who are Poets Laureate of Grand Rapids. It was pretty much a magical experience. So yeah, that's how I connected to that slam event, and I was really honored to be part of it. So Poetry Night has been a tradition at Grand Valley State since 2002, and the Poetry Night has typically brought in some nationally known poets to perform or to read at Grand Valley in the downtown campus. Patricia Clark ran that series for a long time. She retired from Grand Valley during the pandemic. The whole fall art celebration that Poetry Night was a part of was put on hold for a couple of years. And then we came back this year with the charge to sort of, all right, let's get this, let's bring the art celebration back into focus at Grand Valley. I was put on the steering committee and in charge of poetry night. We wanted to do it in person. Unfortunately, we weren't able to do it in person this year. But I wanted to do something that continued the tradition of poetry night at Grand Valley, but also made it connect to our local community. And so I invited Danez Smith, a National Book Award finalist and former World Poetry Slam competitor and finalist, and like super accomplished, nationally known poet with just tremendous writer and tremendous performer. And then I also invited Marcel Price, Fable the Poet, and then Erica Thompson, who's Kid Kane, the Grand Rapids Poet Laureate and the immediate past Grand Rapids Poet Laureate, to read with Danez. And if we had been in the same room, it would have been this magical, incredible night. As it was still magical and incredible. We did it over Zoom, and Marcel read these amazing poems about his love for his wife. Erica read poems about figuring out who she was and sort of advocating for herself in the world. And Danez, of course, was, sparkling and funny and charming and also heartfelt and thoughtful. And because it was virtual, it was accessible to a wide audience. A lot of people, you didn't have to be in Grand Rapids to come. You could just log into the webinar. And I regret that it was virtual because I missed that in-person connection, that bringing together, but it still brought people together. I know there was a class at Grand Valley or an honors college cohort of 60 people watching in one room together. So even with the virtual format, people were there in a place sharing poetry. And again, once again, poetry is not the only thing that brings people together in a room to share art, but it is one thing. And I was super happy to have been able to put that together. We bring in writers from within the community, from within Michigan, from across the nation. We try and bring people to Grand Valley. During the pandemic, we haven't been able to do it in person as much as we would like to, but Zoom can be a great thing for making these events accessible. There are poetry. Literally, if I wanted to, I could go to a poetry reading almost every night of every week now, because poets have discovered here's this technology that we can use to share poetry, and it's accessible to all sorts of people and from across different geographical locations. And I had 2 different online readings this week, and some of them are big, some of them are small, and it doesn't matter. It's people coming together to share poetry and we've always had a reading series in Grand Rapids. There was a reading series at Harmony Brewing Company for a while. I've been to readings at a literati bookstore when it existed. And so there's these small local events that are accessible if you are in that area and able to come, and they're great, but the Zoom has expanded that. And so we're trying to figure out how we can take advantage of the increased accessibility without losing the sort of specialness of being in person. And it's always a balancing act, but it's really great how many poetry readings there are across the nation of just people sharing their poetry. When people ask me, and this is kind of an interview sort of question, why write poetry? Why write and why write poetry? And my sort of standard answer usually has something to do with feeling less lonely in the world. And it's for why I write and why I read. And so I think that language is about communication, and communication is about connection and about community. And I think that poetry events, the reason for a poetry event is not just the poetry. It's that the poetry enables community. The poetry brings people together. So being a poetry slam judge at the Mentally Distilled Slam, another thing that I do is every year I've been a reader for the Scholastic writing competition, which is high school and middle school students. And I tend to read the 11th and 12th grade poetry submissions. This is Adam Skidema, who's a writing professor at Kendall, organizes the regional judging. And so I always get to read all these amazing poems. And those poets, those high school students, they don't know who I am or that I'm the one reading their poems, but they know someone's reading it. And it's an honor to be that person. And I was recently, and I did this with Fable the Poet and some other people from the other side of the state. We were judges at the state Poetry Out Loud competition, which is high school students reciting memorized poems, but not reciting sort of mechanically, but reciting. The whole point is that you have to understand the poem and deliver it in a way that conveys the meaning of the poem, conveys an emotional connection to the poem. And so there are these high school students from all over the state standing on a stage in a room full of a couple hundred people, which I would literally have fallen over dead if you had asked me to do that in high school. No chance could I have done anything in front of that many people. But they're reciting these poems, contemporary poems, classical poems, and doing it with feeling and with polish. And it was just this amazing experience. Like, once again, people in the same room experiencing the language, experiencing that connection. And that's true from big sort of formal competitive events like Poetry Out Loud to reading it in the back room at a pub where there's people who are there to hear the poet read. And so I think there are all events that are like that work for poets are about bringing people together, sharing a space and sharing the language. Some advice that you're often given as a poet, and it's not advice that I really give because I don't think it's not what I follow, but is to follow your obsessions and to be willing to write about your own obsessions, whatever those are. And I feel like I don't really have obsessions. I have mild interests. I feel like I have lots of shallower interests. But what I've always tried to do with my poetry is write about what's important to me. And often it's being a husband, a father, a son, but also what's important to me in the world around me. And so I have a book called Boombox, and a lot of it is about heavy metal, hair metal from the 80s and being in high school. And that was the music that I listened to. And there's this, I think it's not an accurate sense, but there's this sense that some people think that that's not poetic enough, that you should write about, flowers and nature. And of course, fine, write about flowers. You should write about flowers and nature. But I actually think that one of the things that we all need permission to do, and I tell my students this, is to write about what we care about, whether it's something we saw on TikTok or heavy metal music from the 80s or our favorite movies or our favorite video games. We should write about it. My friend Todd Kaneko writes about professional wrestling as well as anybody does because he cares about professional wrestling. But it's not just billboarding your poetry with references to pop culture. It's using that as a way to explore the world, because what's interesting about heavy metal to me is sort of how I felt when I was 17 and listening to it. And so the heavy metal is not just a chance to say, Guns N' Roses rock, but it's okay, why was I drawn to this music that felt sort of rebellious and was also cheesy and it was about sex? And so why was I drawn to that music? Well, who was I in that moment? And so that's what I'm really exploring. And I've always tried to, I tell my students this too, like if you're reading Whitman or Alexander Pope or Dryden, so a poet that might be in an English literature textbook, we need tons of footnotes to understand what they were trying to say, because they're writing in a particular moment, in a particular cultural context. And there's this notion that poetry needs to be timeless. And poetry doesn't need to be timeless. Poetry needs to live in its moment. And so my poems are very much in my moment. Like, I'm listening to heavy metal in high school, I'm going to write about that. The Dad Jokes book is, I'm a dad, so I'm like thinking about what it means to be a father and where my ideas about fatherhood come from. Well, a lot of them come from TV. So I'm going to write about TV dads. So there's poems in this book about these sort of stereotypical sitcom fathers. And it's easy to make fun of those fathers, but also those are the sitcoms I watched when I was growing up. And that's where these ideas about what it means to be a father and a man came from. And that's problematic. And so I'm writing about that as a way to explore my own ideas about fatherhood, my own ideas about masculinity. And of course, some of your ideas come from your parents, but a lot of them come from pop culture. And so I want to use pop culture. And again, not in a way sort of like to billboard and say, look how contemporary this is, and look how niche this is. You have to be a fan of this particular show to understand the poem. But in a way that's the language I have. We write in the language of our time, and the language of our time includes pop culture, and always has. Alexander Pope is writing about the politics of the court, in the British Empire. I don't know what that's like, but he did. And so he's writing in his moment. And so that's what I'm trying to do as well. And thinking about my brand as a poet, it's not really intentional, but I feel like my poems are a pretty good reflection of who I am and how I live my life. That I try to be a good person, and here's what I'm interested in. And I think if you read, my poems are not autobiographical entirely. I lie all the time in my poems. And there's things in the poems that are someone else's story that I've co-opted and used as my own. But I think if you read my poems, you sort of will have a pretty good sense of what kind of person I am. And so I know that there's there's two sides of being a poet, right? There's the making art side, and then there's getting art in front of the world side. And that part requires paying attention to things like, who's going to read your book, and how do you sell your book, and how do you market yourself. But I feel like the art side has to come first and has to be the most important. And so I'm not intentionally setting out to create a brand for myself. That has nothing I'll do that to try to sell the books. But when I'm writing the poems, I'm writing the poems, and I'm not doing it because I think, I need to write some poems about dad jokes because that'll be trendy and it'll sell. What a terrible way to create art that would be. And so I don't do that. I don't think ever. I can't think of a poem I've written where I wrote it because I thought it would sell, or I thought it fit who I am, because poems don't sell. So why try? I think just make a piece of art and make the best art you can make in the moment, and draw from your own experiences, and draw from your own life, and draw from the things that matter to you, whether it's important things that matter to you, like love and parenthood and grief and loss, or frivolous things that matter to you, like the sitcoms you watched as a kid. This is from my book, Seducing the Asparagus Queen, which is my most Michigan book. It's a Midwestern book, a Michigan book. And this is a poem that my father tells me I have some of the details wrong, like it's my poem. So I don't care. It's called Ginsberg in Kalamazoo. After doing a reading for the rich kids at the liberal arts college, Allen Ginsberg ends up at the house my father shares with his friend Bob and whoever else is around. There's music and weed, and Ginsberg is telling everyone that the scarf he's wearing is the same one Dylan wore on the cover of Blonde on Blonde, this tweedy flannel houndstooth thing. Herb Scott is there, trying to get Ginsberg to agree to take a look at some new poems. But Ginsberg is looking for someone to seduce. Some Midwestern farmer's kid still trying to figure out who he is, corn-fed and hungry for something new. It's not working out for the poet or for the hypothetical kid waiting to be entered by the language of disruption. This is a hell of a city, Ginsberg says to my father. You've got to get out of here. My father, watching the evening unfold in a variety of directions, is 24 and stick skinny and already surprised by how his life is turning out. You always know when you're doing something for the first time, but you don't know until later whether it will be the last or only. Even then, you don't know for sure. A year later, in this same house, my mother's water breaks while she's hanging lights on the Christmas tree. And that's when I entered the story, though I like to pretend I was here all along. There's another Michigan poem, and anyone from Michigan will know that from the first 2 lines. It's called Rock, Paper, Scissors, Toast. Doesn't take long to get used to pointing at the palm to indicate where we live now. We like to brag about the produce. We take credit for the lakes. We are surprised when we realize our children will think of this as home. Lack of loyalty is the privilege of the new arrival. This has less to do with any particular state, more to do with the length of time it takes to write everything down. Our grandparents die, keep dying until they are gone. At the funerals, we blend in, say little, compare shoes with the deceased, play ridiculous games with precocious nieces, cousins somehow removed. Toast always loses. Then why would anyone choose toast? Just in case. I'll read a couple from my most recent book, which is Dad Jokes from Late in the Patriarchy. Came out in 2021 during the pandemic, but was written pre-pandemic. A primer. My complaint about life is it happens only in order. A thesis of sorts, a kind of argument that might seem out of place here. But I have seen a man ride his bicycle into Beltline traffic and die. I have seen my grandmother coughing blood after a lifetime of menthols. I have seen the closed casket of a friend who asked the wrong person for a ride home after a long shift. The end of a story is the shape of a hole in the fence the story runs through on its way to the end. Spielberg filmed E.T. in chronological order, so his young cast could deliver an authentic emotional performance. It helped them bond with the alien in the natural course of the narrative, leading to the weepy climax he sought. This anecdote suggests something about art, youth, loss, something about believability, or the cruelty of a man who knows what he wants. We were all Odysseus in those days. A young man learns to shoot and dies in the mud an ocean away from home, a rifle in his fingers and the sky dripping from his heart. Next to him, a friend watches his final breath slip ragged into the ditch, a thing the friend will carry back to America. Wound, souvenir, backstory. He'll teach literature to young people for 40 years. He'll coach his daughter's softball teams, root for Red Wings and Lions and Tigers, dance well, love generously. He'll be quick with a joke and firm with handshakes. He'll rarely talk about the war. If asked, he'll tell you instead his favorite story. Odysseus escaping from the Cyclops with a good wine, a bad pun, and a sharp stick. It's about buying time and making do, he'll say. It's about doing what it takes to get home, and you see, he has been talking about the war all along. We all want the same thing from this world. Call me nobody. Let me live. American Prayer. Some parents on Facebook this morning are wondering whether it's truly PJ Day at the elementary school. Trust but verify and all that, which is something a president once said about international diplomacy, or maybe the motto of a newspaper, I forget. But if your mother says she loves you, check it out, right? What happens if our children wind up alone in their Hogwarts robes, their Stegosaurus fleeces and sloth slippers, classmates clad in the usual jeans, t-shirts, sweaters, and soccer jerseys, track pants, and armor-plated backpacks? Perhaps a valuable lesson in how we're ultimately on our own, in the limits of what we can prepare for, in how we know when things have gone disastrously awry. We have children and hope for the best, my God, but that's not always what we get. Let them wear pajamas, someone's father posts. What's the worst? Though he doesn't mean it. We know the answer. Spring is weeks away, but it's cold, and the sidewalks are winter slick, half melted, refrozen, dangerous. Bundle up, we beg, and our children tumble into the sky of a new day, ceramic, shatterproof, and dressed for dreaming. Childhood goes kaleidoscope, 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 gun. We keep waiting to wake up and know what we're doing. We've learned to be grateful for any colored shard of glass not shaped like a bullet. We are driving in a blizzard, not a metaphor. We could die. I have a lot of responsibility here. And our daughter is telling us a ghost story. We're listening for any clues to the riddle that is her mind at 15. Her life has ceased to revolve around us. There are so many bullets. We've learned not to take these small moments for granted. In this story, the father of the children of her Sims character came to visit, refused to leave. She built a tiny room, lured him in, deleted the door. 30 game days later, he died. The story takes a long time to tell. Our son keeps interrupting to sing "We Got the Beat" and talk about his plans for his new airsoft gun with the biodegradable ammo. Everything is so dangerous. There are no metaphors. It's our fault for giving him what he wanted. This world, its shattered edges. He has 2,000 pellets, a freshly charged battery, a friend to shoot. What more could a boy desire? She likes having the ghost around, she says, better now than when he was alive. And this sounds like a mostly okay ending. Probably all we can ask. Yeah, I mean, I think aren't we all the lonely Cheerio? I mean, it's a line from a joke, or an image from a joke, and it's the joke is one of those. It's a Shaggy Dog joke that takes a long time to tell, and the whole point is that it's a waste of time, and it's sort of a practical joke you're playing on your reader. But the image of a Cheerio wandering around the world trying to find its place, what a poignant image. And I don't know, as soon as my daughter told us that joke, I'm like, all right, I'm using that because I'm drawn to the personification. And of course, yes, we're all the lonely Cheerio. And I love the structure of jokes. And so my book is structured borrows from the structure of jokes. In my first attempt at grad school, one of my professors was David Kirby, who is, I think, a very funny poet. And I saw him read a poem once about a job he had a summer in high school or college. And he was a delivery person for Sears, but one of the jobs they had was repossessing wigs that people had bought on installments, and they weren't making their payments. And so he and his fellow driver would have to go to their house and say, we're here for your wig. And the poem was hilarious. And I'm like, wow, you can do that in a poem? And so it's one of the things that I go to other poets for is permission to do things in my own poems. And he gave me permission. And I had a classmate, Jamie Thomas, who teaches at Ferris. He was my classmate at Western Michigan. And his poems were funny and funny in a way that also led to poignance. And so that's what I'm trying to do. So I'm always thinking about jokes. And of course, if you think about stand-up comics, the best stand-up comics will rip your heart out while they're making you laugh. And so poetry and stand-up comedy have a lot in common that way, I think. And so I'm always interested in humor and how humor is used in poems. And I mean, I called my first book Ha 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 Thump, which feels like, I don't know, you better kind of be witty if you're going to do that. And then I've got dad jokes. And so I appreciate humor in poems. I hope my poems are funny to somebody somewhere, but I hope they use that humor in service of, connecting to the lonely Cheerio, finding a connection to the world and because stand-up comics, they do exactly the same work as a performance poet or as someone they stand up in front of you and whether it's truly autobiographical or not, they're exposing themselves in a way in hopes of getting a reaction. And so I'm interested in that idea of humor and how it connects us in the same way that poetry does. Thinking about the future of poetry is an interesting thought exercise, because poetry, it kind of is what it is. And because I think poetry should resist the whims of the moment and should resist capitalism, and because poetry has no money in it, that we turn to poetry at difficult times as a species. We turn to poetry at difficult times. We turn to poetry to bring us together when we're trying to understand grief, when we're trying to understand loss, when we're trying to understand love, when we're trying to understand something as big as the pandemic. People read poetry, and so people, I think, will always move towards poetry. And how they find poetry, how they access poetry, that changes because technology changes and how we live changes. But I think one of the things that's comforting about poetry is that the poetry doesn't have to change. The poetry is just, here's a person putting language on a page or into the air, and that language, and hoping someone hears, hoping someone reads it. And whether I'm posting poems on Instagram or reading my poems on YouTube, that's not really what's important. The important part is making art and finding someone to share that art with. And so I think the future of poetry is to keep doing what it has always done, which is be available to people for whom language is their medium, all artists choose a different medium. And I tell my students this, poetry is just art built out of language. It's not, instead of clay or paint or ceramics or wood, or you've chosen language. And so you mold language to make something, to share with someone else. It's not a diary entry. It's not therapy. There's value in therapeutic poetry and in using poetry that way, but that's not really fundamentally what it is, because you're sharing it with someone else. I'm making this. And so I think there are so many people who care about poetry and finding ways to bring poetry into schools, finding ways to bring poetry into community centers. Here in Grand Rapids, I know the work the Diatribe has done is just amazing. They have brought poetry to so many people who didn't think poetry was for them, who didn't think that anyone cared about their voice and what they had to say. So I'm just in awe of the work that they have done. I saw them do a classroom. I got to attend a classroom visit that they did once, and the students were thinking about their own voice in a way that they'd never thought about their own voice before. And so the future of poetry is the people who care about poetry continuing to do it, continuing to carry it into spaces, whatever those spaces may be, whether they're virtual spaces or physical spaces. And it's the people who care about it will always care about it. The world doesn't care about poetry. If you walk out down the street and say, do you like poetry? Most people will say no, but they don't really mean it. They just haven't read the right poem yet. Or they were taught poems wrong. They were taught poems as riddles and things that they need to interpret, and the teacher had the key. But even those people will turn to poems when they're trying to find ways to understand something big and complicated and important in their life. And so I think you don't have to like all poems to like poetry. No one likes all poems. Most poems are not for me, but there are so many poems where I see myself, and I think everyone finds themselves in poems. And so I don't have a sort of like an architectural notion of the future of poetry, because it resists shape, it resists form, and it resists a prescribed path. That's what we should do as poets, is fight against the prescribed path anyway, right? This is my path. These are my words, my language. And that's what all poets are doing. And then find ways to deliver that to each other, whether it's social media, Instagram, performance, poem, writing poems for competitions, publishing poems in literary journals that 10 people read, sharing your poems with your mom. It doesn't matter. All of it counts. All of it is what the art is supposed to be doing. And so I don't think that's ever going away. I can't imagine a world where we don't turn to poetry, even in difficult times. There's an invasion in Ukraine and everyone starts sharing Ilya Kaminsky's poem about what it's about, war, and how difficult war is, and how difficult war is on people who think it's not difficult on them, people who think they're exempt from it, people who think it can't happen here, and Ilya Kaminsky, implicates them in that and calls them out for that, and we turn immediately to poetry when stuff happens, and I think we always will. I mean, one thing about Grand Rapids is that there are so many venues for poetry here. It's probably true of anywhere if it's important to you, but we're not really a college town. We have Grand Valley, but we're bigger than a college town. But we have lots of colleges, and they all bring in poets. And then there's this sort of the cultural value of poetry that I think is, I don't know if it's not unique to Grand Rapids. I think you could probably find it in most cities. But I think we are lucky to live in a city where it's so transparent. I mean, even this project, right? There's so many people that you could have interviewed for this project who have done things connected to poetry in Grand Rapids and in West Michigan. I've been to readings at Aquinas, at Calvin, at Hope, at Grand Valley. I've been to the Poetry Slam in the upstairs room at a distillery. I've been to, there's so many places where you can connect with poetry here. And I think that's really special. And we're lucky to live in a city where that's possible. And again, probably every city has that because poetry is everywhere. But it's definitely part of Grand Rapids culture. And there's so many talented poets living and working here. I met a poet recently who lives in my neighborhood, and I blurbed her book, and her book is coming out, and it's amazing. And there's just lots of poets around Grand Rapids, and people who care about poetry and who do the necessary work to make sure that there are spaces for poetry here. And so I think we're lucky to live here, and we're lucky that so many people care about poetry.